Okay. Well, welcome back. This is going to be the last episode of our Apostle Paul Bible study. This is going to be episode 36, and we are going to see here Paul's life come to an end. And over the last few weeks, several weeks really, Paul has been in Rome under house arrest. And so we kind of followed all of that as people would come and go to visit him, as he wrote letters and received letters, just a lot of things that have happened. And last week we talked about his release. Nero had come back after being away for a long time. And of course, they took some time to call in the people that had brought these charges against Paul, but nobody came from Jerusalem, and so his case was dismissed and he was released. And so all this happened around 64 A.D. and he wrote a letter to Timothy, and I think instead of going back into Asia Minor, he may have gone up into Europe, as far away as Spain. Some Bible scholars think for a final journey. At some point, he comes back into Rome, into the Roman Empire, and is rearrested. In fact, after the fires burned in Rome, uh, Nero blamed the Christians, which turned everybody really against the Christians. There wasn't a big focus on Christians at that time, but they ended up blaming all the Christians. And at some point, uh, Paul was rearrested, Peter was rearrested, and John was arrested and sent to the island of Patmos. And so that's what happened in 67 AD. We're going to see Paul's life come to an end. Peter's life also come to an end. And while John escaped death, he was sent to the island of Patmos for his preaching of the gospel. In 68 AD, Nero is going to commit suicide, and a new emperor is going to come in. And because of the hate that was stirred up against the Christians and the Jews and everything that's going on there, he's going to end up going in and destroying Jerusalem. And so in 70 AD, Jerusalem is defeated, the temple's destroyed, and Jerusalem really ceases to exist as a nation until 1947, after World War II, when they reestablished their national identity. And so we know from the Bible study that I did on the end times that period from the end of Jerusalem until the reemergence of Jerusalem is known basically as the church age. And so it was beginning in the first century, and we are in the last stage, the apostate church, the falling away of the church now as Israel reemerges into the world scene. And so if you're interested in that, you can go back and watch my Bible study on the last days and how all that played in. But we're going to look here briefly at the end of Paul's life. And I want to look first at this. We know that Paul was released after his house arrest because nobody really came to support their charges against him, and so he was released. And we see after that Seneca, who was one of Nero's trusted advisors, he fell out of favor and was forced into retirement. And so Nero ruled without restraint. On July 18th, 64 AD, fires broke out in Rome, and 3 districts were destroyed, and he feared the Roman people might suspect his involvement, so he blamed Christians. And so this is where the hatred of Christians in the Roman Empire really began and became strong. Paul, as we know, went off on another journey for a couple years, and he came back. Says when he returned to Rome, he was placed under arrest. He was imprisoned in a cold dungeon, so he wasn't under house arrest like before. He was chained up like a common criminal, and Peter also was taken in, and they may have been in the same dungeon. I don't know. I'm sure each district had their own dungeons, but Peter was crucified. But because Paul was a Roman citizen, it was against the law to crucify him. And so tradition suggests that he was taken out of the city and beheaded. And then on June 9th, 68 AD, Nero committed suicide. And so that's kind of where we stand there. I want to look real quick at the Paul's timeline. Of course, we've gone through his whole life, and 36 episodes. We've gone through his childhood, through his early life, through his beginning ministry there in Jerusalem, We went through his conversion, his first, his second, and his third missionary journeys. And then we have spent all this time talking about his house arrest and the things that went on there. And so after his house arrest, of course, he's released. We know Rome burns. And so Peter writes First Peter, really um, in response to the burning of Rome, the blaming of Christians. And so if you want to go back and read First Peter, you have a better understanding of why it was written. And then for a few years following this, Paul may have visited Europe. And then Paul and Peter were both arrested in 67. And John, of course, the Apostle John, was sent to Patmos Island, which is where he had his revelation vision. And during this time of imprisonment, Paul writes a last letter to Timothy, and Peter writes Second Peter, and then they are put to death. And then Nero dies after Peter is crucified. Paul is beheaded, and then Jude, in response to apostasy from all of this hatred towards the church, writes his letter to Jude. And so I find it interesting. The first book of the Bible that was written was James, which was Jesus' half brother. And this book here is Jude, is Jesus' half brother. And the only thing that's going to be left to write after this will be the writings of John. By this time, John is the last apostle alive. And so he is still on Patmos Island. Of course, in 70 AD, Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed by Titus, the emperor. And then John will return to Ephesus, and he will write all of his books, the book of John, the book of Revelation, and then the Gospels, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And so that will conclude all the writings of the New Testament canon. That concludes the life of Paul. And so here's my list of chronological books. And see, we have James, half brother, writes the first letter when Herod kills John, and then Jude writes this last letter after the church is blamed for the fires in Rome. And then, of course, we have John's final uh, revelations and gospels that are put into there. But and so that completes. And we're going to look real quick at Paul's letter to Timothy. And so Paul wrote this letter to Timothy. And this really suggests, this talks about Timothy being from Lystra and how he got into Paul's ministry, which we've already talked about. He wrote in 67 AD to encourage Timothy to continue the work. Paul knew he was going to die. And so he really was preparing him. And we have this quick outline. Chapter 1 talks about the perseverance of a man of God, patterns of a man of God, perils of a man of God, and preaching of a man of God. So this really is another one of the the pastoral epistles, the two letters to Timothy and the letter to Titus, which Paul wrote specifically to the pastors for church leadership. And so I was going to go real quick. Like the Second Timothy is only 4 chapters. It's real quick, easy to read if you want to read through it. Now, chapter 1 talks about Paul standing, or Timothy standing firm in his faith and in his teaching. In fact, chapter 1 verse 8 says, "Be not thou ashamed for the testimony of the Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but be partaker of the afflictions of the gospel." So he's basically saying, stand up, stand firm in your faith and in the doctrine that you preach. In chapter 2, we see here he talks about being enduring, not just standing up for it, but enduring through it. And so chapter 2 verse 10 says, "I endure all things for the elect's sake," and that is Christ church. As leaders of Christ church, preachers have a responsibility to be an example, to stand up above the persecutions and all things to come towards the church, that they may obtain salvation. If you look at verse 15, he talks about study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed. He also says in verse 22 to flee. He says here, "Flee youthful lust, but allow righteousness, faith, charity, and peace, and all them that call on the Lord with a pure heart." So he's basically saying, here, purge yourself, live honorably, study God's word, live a life according to Christian principles. And then in verse 24 and 25, he's saying to instruct. So you're studying, you're living the right example, and you're instructing other people on how to live that. He says the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto men, all men, apt to teach and patient, in meekness instructing those. And so he's he's basically laying out the a minister's responsibility to their congregation. In chapter 3, he warns of a changing church, talks about perilous times, the changing of men's behavior. And he says in verse 7, people will be ever learning, but not able to come to a knowledge of truth. And so the church is going to change as they fall away. And as I previously mentioned, we are kind of in that falling away. People are abandoning doctrines of the Bible for religious experience, and they're claiming that their experience basically overrules the doctrines of the Bible. But my argument is a lot of these experiences are driven by spirits that are not of God, and there's really no way to tell when you start getting involved in the spiritual realm. There's no way to tell if it's of God or if it's of Satan. So God says to avoid all of that stuff and stick to the doctrines of the Bible. And that's why the church is falling away. They're getting caught up into emotionalism and being led by experience instead of studying and sticking to foundational truths of biblical doctrine. And then or chapter 4 talks about the rewards for perseverance, for sticking to the doctrines when other people fall away. He says, verse 2, preach the word, be instant in season and out of season. So, be long suffering for the doctrine. The time will come when people will not endure sound doctrine, which is where we're at. They turn their ears to fables. I mean, think of all the people in the church that believe in um, evolution, which is not a biblical doctrine. Creation is a biblical doctrine. Evolution is a fable. All the people in the church that believe in aliens, that is not biblical doctrine. The Bible says God created the heavens and the earth. He created the angels and he created man. It doesn't talk about creating alien life on other planets. And so that's, biblical doctrine. God created man on earth, and fables are God created aliens. But people in the churches are buying into all of these fables because they're focused on their feelings and on experience that they may have, led by whatever spirits that they don't know are leading them. And so it just keeps on going, watch and all things, endure afflictions, do the work of the ministry. That's another thing the church is not doing, the work of the ministry. Says Paul said in verse 7, I fought the good fight, I've finished my course, I've kept the faith, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. So he's explaining to Timothy that there are rewards for continuing to do the work according to the Bible and to his teachings. And so that's going to wrap it up. Paul was beheaded on let me go back to, where was it? Was it this one? No, I forgot which one it was. Anyway, Paul was beheaded around 67, 68 AD, and Peter was crucified upside down. And so, because he didn't feel like he was worthy to die the same way his Lord and Master died. And so John is left, and he's going to write these other books. But that's going to conclude our Bible study. I'm going to do a follow-up with like a Q&A session like I've done in other Bible studies for the Apostle Paul, and those videos are to come. We are going to get in this fall into some false teaching videos. I'm going to talk about some things that are being taught in churches that aren't biblical doctrine and why they're not, and why the churches are being led astray. So I hope you'll join me this fall for those Bible studies. I thank you for being with me through all of this. I love you and appreciate your support for my channel. We'll see you next time. God bless you.